The cabin hummed with the low rumble of an airplane engine. Families, business travelers, and honeymooners bustled about, cramming carry-ons into overhead bins and settling into their seats. The air was thick with chatter, laughter, and the occasional frustrated grunt as someone struggled to fit a too large bag into an overhead compartment. Ava Washington, an 11-year-old girl with her hair styled in neat cornrows adorned with colorful beads, sat quietly in seat 12A. She clutched a slightly worn paperback of Matilda by Roald Dahl, her favorite escape into a world where cleverness triumphed over cruelty. Her eyes scanned the pages, occasionally glancing up to take in the excitement around her. It was her first time flying, and though her face betrayed no nerves, her tightly clasped hands revealed her apprehension. Ava's father, Charles Washington, was in seat 12B, leaning back and casually scrolling through his tablet. Charles exuded a quiet confidence, his tailored navy suit and polished leather shoes a testament to his success as a civil rights attorney. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and a sharp gaze, he was a commanding presence, though he carried himself with warmth. "Buckle up, sweetheart," he said gently, glancing at Ava. She nodded and obediently secured her seatbelt. "Do you think we'll fly through clouds?" she asked, her voice soft yet curious. "Definitely. You'll get to see them up close," Charles replied with a smile. "It's like floating through a cotton field." Before Ava could respond, a voice interrupted their moment. "Sir, I'll need you to put that tablet away before we take off," the flight attendant said briskly. Charles looked up. The woman, who appeared to be in her mid-30s, had the perfectly polished look expected of flight attendants: neat blonde hair, bright red lipstick, and a crisp uniform. Her name and egg read Madison. "Of course," Charles said, setting the device aside. Madison's eyes shifted to Ava, and her expression subtly changed. The warm, professional smile faded ever so slightly, replaced by a cool detachment. "Is she traveling alone?" Madison asked, her tone light but pointed. Charles frowned slightly. "No, she's with me." Madison nodded, but her gaze lingered on Ava. "Well, make sure she behaves. We can't have disruptions during the flight," she added with a tight smile before walking away. Charles stared after her, his jaw tightening. He said nothing to Ava, who had returned to her book, but a flicker of unease passed through him. The plane had been in the air for nearly an hour. Most passengers had settled into their routines, watching movies, chatting, or drifting off to sleep. Ava was engrossed in her book, a small smile playing on her lips as she read about Matilda's clever pranks. Charles, sitting beside her, had his tray table down with his tablet resting on it, though his attention frequently shifted to his daughter. It was her first flight, and though she seemed calm, he could sense her underlying excitement and nervousness. The drake cart rattled its way down the aisle, pushed by Madison, the flight attendant. Her steps were brisk, her posture upright, exuding the kind of professionalism expected at 30,000 feet. As she served passengers, her voice was warm and polite, her smile wide and practiced. But when she reached Ava and Charles, her demeanor shifted. Her smile dimmed, replaced by a tight-lipped expression. "Something to drink?" she asked, her tone clipped. Charles didn't react immediately, observing the subtle change in her attitude. "I'll have a ginger ale," he said evenly. "And for her?" Madison asked, nodding toward Ava. "Apple juice, please," Ava said politely, her voice soft but clear. Madison handed Charles his drink first. The can and cup passed with precision. But when she turned to Ava, the smoothness of her movements faltered. The cup tilted in her hand, and before anyone could react, cold juice spilled onto Ava's lap. "Oh!" Ava gasped, her eyes wide as the liquid soaked into her jeans. She dropped her book onto the tray table, her hands fluttering helplessly over the wet fabric. Madison sighed audibly, not in alarm or concern, but in irritation, as if the spill had been Ava's fault. She pulled a single napkin from her cart and thrust it toward the girl. "You need to be more careful," she said, her tone sharp. Ava froze, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She glanced at her father, unsure of how to respond. Charles leaned forward, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "It looks like the cup wasn't steady. Do you have more napkins?" Madison let out a huff, clearly annoyed, and pulled 2 more napkins from the cart. She handed them to Charles without a word, her lips pressed into a thin line. She should have taken it properly, Madison muttered under her breath as she turned to move on. Charles's jaw tightened. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm enough to halt her in her tracks. Madison turned back, one eyebrow raised in question, though the corners of her mouth twitched downward. Charles held her gaze. "Accidents happen, but I'd appreciate it if you didn't place blame on my daughter for something that wasn't her fault." Madison's polite facade cracked for a split second, irritation flashing in her eyes. "Of course," she said curtly, the words clipped as if they'd been dragged out of her. Without waiting for a response, she turned and pushed the cart down the aisle, her steps more hurried. Ava dabbed at her jeans with the napkins, her small hands trembling slightly. "It's okay, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. Charles reached over and gently rested a hand on hers. "Are you sure?" She nodded but kept her gaze fixed on her lap. The embarrassment lingered, pooling in her chest, like the juice that had soaked into her jeans. Charles's eyes followed Madison as she moved further down the aisle. His expression remained calm, but a flicker of something darker, frustration, maybe anger, passed across his face. He said nothing for the moment, letting Ava return to her book while he leaned back in his seat. An hour later, Madison was back, her drink cart rattling down the aisle once more. This time, her focus seemed deliberately elsewhere as she served the rows in front of Charles and Ava. When she reached their row, she didn't stop. "Excuse me," Charles said, his voice louder this time, carrying over the hum of the engines. Madison paused and turned, her expression stiff. "Yes?" "You missed us," Charles said evenly, gesturing to the empty cup holders in front of them. Madison blinked, feigning surprise. "Oh, I must have. What would you like?" Charles's tone remained calm, but his words were deliberate. "I'll have a water, Ava." Water too, please," Ava said hesitantly, not lifting her eyes from her book. Madison nodded and reached into the cart. She placed 1 bottle of water on Charles's tray table, then hesitated before placing a second bottle in front of Ava. Instead of setting it down smoothly, she let it drop with a dull thud, causing Ava to flinch. "Here you go," Madison said, her voice tinged with indifference. Charles stared at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Thank you," he said, his tone carrying an unmistakable weight. Madison didn't respond. She pushed the cart away, her movements quicker than before, and disappeared toward the front of the plane. Ava took a tentative sip of her water, but her earlier excitement about the flight had waned. Charles leaned back in his seat, his hands clasped tightly on his lap. He glanced around the cabin, noting the attentive gazes of several nearby passengers who had witnessed the interaction. Some looked away when he caught their eyes, while others gave him small nods of solidarity. The tipping point came just before the flight attendants began preparing for landing. Ava, feeling thirsty again, raised her hand to call for assistance. Madison passed by twice without acknowledging her. Finally, Charles pressed the call button. Madison approached, her smile brittle. "Yes, sir." "Is there a problem here?" Daniel asked, his tone even, though his eyes betrayed weariness. "Yes," Charles replied, his voice composed but firm. He rose slightly from his seat, towering with a quiet authority that drew attention from nearby passengers. "My daughter and I have been subjected to consistent poor treatment from this flight attendant. From her dismissive tone to her overt actions, it's evident there's a bias at play, and I won't let it go unaddressed." Daniel's expression stiffened, his professionalism battling with the gravity of the accusation. "Bias? Sir, that's a serious claim to make." "I'm well aware," Charles said, his posture straight and unyielding. "I'm a civil rights attorney. I don't make accusations lightly." The weight of his words hung in the air, and a ripple of murmurs spread among the passengers. "He's right," said an elderly woman seated in the row ahead, twisting in her seat to face Daniel. "I noticed it too. She was so kind to everyone else, but with them, it's different." "Same here," a man across the aisle chimed in. He gestured toward Madison, who stood rigid beside Daniel. She skipped their row earlier. and the way she dropped that water bottle, completely uncalled for. Madison's face flushed deep red, her confidence visibly wavering. "I didn't do anything wrong," she protested, her voice sharp but unsteady. "I treated them like everyone else." "That's demonstrably false," Charles said, keeping his tone calm but cutting. His gaze shifted to Daniel. "If you have records of this flight's service logs, review them. Look at how many snacks were distributed and to whom. Review the service calls and the delays in responses. You'll find the patterns yourself. The evidence doesn't lie." Daniel blinked, absorbing Charles's steady yet relentless logic. His shoulders sagged slightly as he realized the issue was more serious than he'd anticipated. "I'll investigate this matter thoroughly, sir," Daniel said, his voice measured. "In the meantime, I'll personally oversee that you and your daughter receive proper service for the remainder of this flight." "Thank you," Charles said, his tone unwavering yet respectful. His body language was poised, back straight, arms relaxed but ready, his entire demeanor radiating confidence. His voice had not risen once, yet it commanded the room. Daniel nodded and turned to Madison. "Come with me," he said curtly. Without waiting for her response, he began walking toward the back of the plane. Madison hesitated, her eyes darting around the cabin, where the stares of passengers burned into her. Muttering under her breath, she followed him. As the tension eased, Charles turned back to Ava, who had been quietly watching the interaction unfold, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up at him, her large eyes filled with worry and confusion. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. Charles knelt beside her seat, his imposing frame suddenly softening as he dropped to her level. "Yes, sweetheart." "Did I do something wrong?" Ava's voice cracked, and she looked away as tears welled in her eyes. The question struck Charles like a physical blow. He reached out, gently placing his hands over hers, his touch steady and reassuring. "No, Ava," he said, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "You didn't do anything wrong, not a single thing." Her lip quivered. Then why? Why was she mean to us? Charles took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wanted to protect her innocence while teaching her a truth she would inevitably encounter. "Sometimes," he began, his tone measured, "people treat others unfairly because of how they look, where they're from, or who they are. It's not right, and it's never okay. But that says everything about them and absolutely nothing about you. Do you understand?" Ava nodded slowly, his words sinking in, though her small shoulders still sagged under the weight of the moment. "I think so." Charles smiled gently and brushed a stray curl from her forehead. "And I need you to remember something else, too. No matter what happens, you deserve respect and kindness, just like anyone else. And when someone forgets that, it's my job to remind them." Ava managed a faint smile, though her eyes remained glossy. "Okay, Dad." He stood, straightening his blazer with deliberate movements, and sat back down beside her. The plane began its descent, but the atmosphere in the cabin remained charged. A few passengers offered Charles discreet smiles or nods of encouragement as they passed to use the restroom. The elderly woman from earlier leaned back toward him. "You handled that beautifully," she said in a low voice. "Not many people would have stayed so composed." Charles inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Thank you. My daughter deserves better than what she got today." As the flight landed and passengers prepared to disembark, Daniel returned to their row. His expression was more resolved this time, though the weariness in his eyes remained. "Mr. James," he began, addressing Charles formally. "I've spoken with Ms. Carter and taken note of the situation. You'll be hearing from our management team shortly, and I'll personally ensure that this incident is escalated appropriately. We value all of our passengers, and I'm sorry that this happened." Charles met his gaze, nodding. "I appreciate that, Daniel. But understand this, it's not just about us. This is about ensuring no other child or parent has to endure what we did today. I trust you'll handle it accordingly." Daniel swallowed, visibly affected by Charles' unwavering resolve. "Yes, sir, I will." As Charles guided Ava down the aisle, her small hand tucked safely in his, he felt the stares of passengers following them. He could feel the mix of sympathy, admiration, and, from some, discomfort. He straightened his shoulders, silently promising his daughter and himself that he'd continue to stand for her, no matter what battles lay ahead. The remainder of the flight passed without incident. Daniel personally attended to Ava and Charles, offering them complimentary meals and ensuring they were comfortable. When the plane landed, Madison was noticeably absent as passengers disembarked. Instead, she stood at the gate, flanked by Daniel and a senior airline representative. "Mr. Washington," the representative said, extending a hand. "I'm Lisa Carter, the airline's regional manager. I want to personally apologize for the treatment you and your daughter received today. We take such matters very seriously." "Thank you," Charles said, shaking her hand. "I trust this will be addressed appropriately." Lisa nodded. "Rest assured, it will. We're committed to ensuring our staff upholds the highest standards of professionalism and respect." Charles glanced at Madison, who looked down, avoiding his gaze. For a brief moment, he considered letting the matter rest, but then he thought of Ava, of the lesson she needed to learn, and the example he needed to set. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice firm but measured, "this isn't just about us. It's about ensuring no one else experiences this kind of treatment. I'd like to arrange a meeting with your diversity and inclusion team to discuss broader training initiatives." Lisa blinked, caught off guard by the request, but then she nodded. "Absolutely, I'll make the arrangements." Charles turned to Madison, his gaze steady. "I hope you reflect on today, Madison. Everyone deserves respect, regardless of how they look or who they are." Madison swallowed hard, her composure cracking. I will," she murmured. As Charles and Ava walked away, Ava slipped her hand into her father's. "Dad." "Yes, sweetheart." "You were like Matilda's dad today," she said with a small smile. Charles chuckled. "Well, I hope I was more like Miss Honey." Ava giggled, the sound light and full of hope. Despite the day's challenges, she felt safe, and she knew her father would always fight for her, no matter what.